Interestingly enough, this did not begin with the Turks. Hindu kings had been desecrating one another's temples since at least the 6th century. I can only say this, that I've come across no cases where a village temple was even touched by anyone, Hindu or Muslim, because they have no political meaning. They have no political significance.
Because you mentioned the word narrative, reconstructing history from narratives. And narratives are rooted in ideas, in the way you interpret the world and your understanding of the world. So how did your training in philosophy impact your later work in history?
The Mughals don't care about religion, but they do want stability. And they know that if there is a temple or a mosque, that will serve kind of like a nucleus that will hold the community together.
Question at root is because people say that Islam expanded by sword or Sufi or conversions. If it is not the case, then how did Islam become such an important force and such a massive force in terms of the sheer number of people that practice that religion?
The problem is ultimately that history has been weaponized, not just language. When the Prime Minister speaks of 1,200 years of slavery, Baraso Salgi Golami.
Tell us a little more about also the temple grants. I mean, while all of this is happening, the same Mughal rulers or other rulers, they're also patronizing or giving patronage to some local temple, like they're giving to, mosques.
Thankfully, there are some studies coming out recently by respected scholars who are finally getting around to writing proper biographies of Aurangzeb that I hope will supersede what we've been living with now for over a century, which is the work of Jagannath Sarkar.
The way this narrative, which is Hindutva, the way it is weaponizing all of this idea of a temple below the mosque, and why all of these mosques then needs to be erased to reclaim that past identity. So what is truth and what is myth about all of this narrative which is happening right now in India?
Today, we are joined by Richard M. Eaton, one of the most influential historians of pre-modern and early modern India. His work, ranging from the rise of Islam in the Bengal frontier to India in the Persianate Age, has radically reshaped how we understand Islam's history in South Asia. Eaton challenges simplistic narratives of conversion, identity, and conflict in South Asian history. Instead, he offers a view of the subcontinent shaped by gradual cultural exchanges, fluid religious identities, and shared Persianate worlds. He is currently a professor of history of the University of Arizona. In today's conversation, we touch on different moments and ideas from his work while asking a deeper question. What does it mean to do justice to the past, especially when the past is being weaponized?
Welcome to Nous, Dr. Eaton.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
Professor Eaton, when I was trying to read about you, learn about your life, so many things came in front of me. And even while having this conversation with you before starting this podcast, you're talking about your parents being in Iran. You're talking about your experience of an elephant in zoo in some other YouTube video. You're talking about how you went to India through Iran. And you also have this background of first pursuing philosophy and then moving to history and specifically South Asian history. How did all of that happen? How did you, I don't know whether it's love, how did you fall in love with doing history of India and specifically Indian Islamic history?
Right. Well, there's lots of questions in there. I guess I'll start with history itself. As you rightly pointed out, I majored in philosophy as an undergraduate. And after graduation, I went straight into the Peace Corps, the American Peace Corps, the first project to Iran in 1962 to 64.
What is a Peace Corps?
The Peace Corps is an organization that was established by John Kennedy at that time, 1961, 62. So I was at the very beginning of this project. And the idea was to send Americans out into the world and work with ordinary people, rather than embassy to embassy where elites are talking to elites. Kennedy's idea was we need to establish a more grassroots approach to forming and maintaining ties between the United States and the rest of the world. And it was a brilliant idea, I might say. Very successful in many ways. The idea was essentially Americans, especially a lot of us were recent graduates like myself, who went out into the world, in my case, Iran. That's where they sent me. And the idea was to impart basic information. And in our case, we were establishing schools structured around teaching agriculture. Because the Shah, this is before the revolution, the Shah had recently established a land reform whereby land was taken from the landlords and given to the cultivators. But many of the cultivators did not know how to manage the land. So the Peace Corps was brought in to work in these so-called Donasser-Ayakesh-Avarzi, which means agricultural normal schools, where we're training youths, 18, 19-year-old Iranian kids, in farm mechanics, animal husbandry, poultry farming, and so forth. And I would go back to their villages and teach the people who had recently received land how to do these things. So that was my entry. That's how I got to Iran.
Why were you interested in this kind of work to begin with?
Well, I was just doing what they told me to do.
Why did you join that organization? What was your interest in joining the organization?
Because I wanted to expand my horizons. I've been living a very provincial life up until that point. Only been out of the country once before that time, and that was only as far as Canada. So the Peace Corps offered an opportunity to see something of a very different culture, which it certainly was. And besides, we were all, I think, to some degree, maybe naive, but we bought into John Kennedy's idea of spreading American knowledge to the rest of the world, and I think it did succeed in many respects in doing just that. But the real impact of the Peace Corps was the effect it had on us. We probably had some effect on Iranians. For me, it was totally transformative because it was a 2-year term of service. After the first year, we had about 2 or 3 months vacation because there was no classes at that time. So I, together with 2 other volunteers, decided we would go to India. It was only 1,000 miles away or so, and we thought that would be a great idea. We can just take 3rd-class trains all around, Pakistan and India. So we did that, and for me, that was a very transformative thing to do because I had already spent 1 year in Iran. I learned some language by that time, and a lot about the culture, and I was kind of already absorbing a lot of Persian sensibilities, architecture, cuisine, so forth. So when I went to India, I immediately recognized a lot of what I was already familiar with in Iran.
There was some continuity in culture?
Absolutely, a lot of continuity. I mean, if you go to the Taj Mahal, you instantly see Iran. In fact, the architects were from Isfahan, the architects who built the Taj. And we saw the Taj, we did that. And so that awakened in me an interest in not just history of India, but also a history of the relationship between South Asia and Iran. And that trip that I made, lasting no more than 1 month, really set the agenda for my entire career.
You also mentioned about your parents or your father living in Iran. So was it before you going to Iran?
Correct. My great-grandfather had gone to Iran in the mid-19th century, 1872
Oh, that long ago.
to 1892, yeah. And he was a Presbyterian missionary
Okay.
stationed in a little village called Urumia. And I have his letters, by the way. I was in Philadelphia last year, and I went to the Presbyterian Historical Society and was able to microfilm or download onto a flash drive all of the letters. So one day I would like to write a biography of him and tie it into a broader study of Iran. Anyway, yeah, he went out there in the 1870s and 80s, and my grandmother was born there.
Oh, interesting.
She was born in Tabriz, which is exactly the place where I was sent by the Peace Corps.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Right. Well, as they say in Persian, it's sarnavesht. It's written on your head.
Okay.
Destiny. So that's how that whole thing began. I made that was my parents were already living in Iran. They were themselves were medical personnel. My father ran the American hospital in Mashhad, and he was a surgeon. He lived there for 10 years, and it happened that they were there when I came to Iran in the Peace Corps in 1962. So that's the background of how I first encountered India and also Iran.
Because I just mentioned, and you told me, your background was in philosophy as a majors and
In college.
Right. So why not do philosophy of ideas of Iran and India, and as opposed to that history of Iran and India? Why that shift from your graduation studies to history writing?
I think it's because when I came back from the Peace Corps, from Iran back to America, I had no job. But I was driving a car from New York to my hometown in Michigan. And along the way, I was stopping at various towns and talking to superintendent of education, asking them if they needed anyone to teach anything.
Oh,
Anything.
anything.
And the first offer that came up was that they said, well, we need somebody to teach history at this little school in the middle of West Virginia. I said, fine, I'll be happy to do that. So suddenly I found myself teaching American history to 10th graders and world geography to 11th graders or 12th graders. And I became so fascinated by the process of reconstructing through narrative the history of something. In this case, I was assigned by the newspaper to write a history of the county.
Okay.
Because they were celebrating the centennial of the county. They needed somebody to write a history. And I was the only historian in the county. I was teaching high school. So I automatically was required to write the history of the county. And as I said, I became so fascinated by the process of how you do that, that I said, this is just too much fun. I'm going to keep on doing this. I want to study history. And by this time, I'd already been exposed to India, having just come back from Iran. So there was no question that I knew two things. I want to study India, and I want to study history.
So you're training in philosophy, and philosophy expands your horizons in terms of ideas. What impact did it have? Because you mentioned the word narrative, reconstructing history from narratives. And narratives are rooted in ideas, in the way you interpret the world and your understanding of the world. So how did your training in philosophy impact your later work in history?
Not much, really. It's true. I mean, philosophy is a useful discipline, I think, in training critical thinking skills, which is at the heart of all historical scholarship, after all. I mean, history is more than just narrating a story. It's also solving a problem.
Yeah.
And I've dabbled in both. But without philosophy, I would not probably have had the foundation, I think, that I would have needed, for that kind of thing.
So then what is the methodology of history? How do you do history?
It depends on what the problem is. For me, there are two major branches of history. One is narrative, and one is problem solving or question answering. When I wrote my book on the social history of the Deccan, which was commissioned by Cambridge University Press, it's right here. Yes. I was commissioned by Cambridge University Press to write to write a social history of the Deccan. They gave me the title.
Okay,
they gave me the title, but I was challenged with how do I do that? The problem with the Deccan is that there's no single center. There's no single language. There's no single capital. It's not like North India where you have this huge Delhi. Now we have New Delhi. And capital cities tend to attract revenue, foreign travelers, everything, mercenaries. So there's a certain locus there that unifies it. The Deccan has no such thing. It's a scatter zone, as the geographers would call it, a scatter zone, a shatter zone. Meaning you have Kannada, you have Marathi, and you have Telugu. That's what defines the Deccan. They're not one language, three. And you have many capital cities. You have Bidar, you have Vijayanagara, you have Gulbarga, Ahmednagar, Bijapur, Golconda. And so how do you write, how do you approach something that diffuses all that? And I discovered biography. I went to the National Museum. I happened to be in Washington, D.C., and there was a big art exhibit of all the art of Vermeer, the Dutch painter, who only did portraits, or mainly did portraits of people. And I was inspired by that because it occurred to me that what people are fascinated by his art, Vermeer's art, is his ability to capture not just a personality, but a whole world in a portrait. Yeah. And people are basically interested in people. Biography is a powerful mechanism for conveying.
It makes it easier for people to
relate.
To relate.
Exactly. And Vermeer did it with a paintbrush through art. And I suddenly realized that there's portraiture is to art as biography is to history. So I decided I'm going to go write the social history of the Deccan using biographies. This was entirely narrative. Each chapter was a different person, and each person represented a particular social process. It could be slavery, it could be banditry, social banditry, it could be Brahmin, non-Brahmin conflict, it could be merchant. So I chose one individual to capture one of those processes and wrote it all through narrative. So that was entirely narrative. You asked me how I do history. Well, that's one way of doing it. But then when I come to a book like the Bengal book, that's not narrative at all. There I'm trying to solve a problem.
The rise of
Islam and the Bengal
frontier.
Exactly. And I wanted to understand, how does one explain the fact of all these huge population of Muslims in eastern India, in Bengal? And within Bengal, why is it on the eastern side and not the western side? When you think of the flow of migrants and ideas and things usually coming down the Gangetic Plain, well, fine. But how then do you explain Islam emerging in the furthest end of that plain and not the nearer part? So these were big questions that I was raising. And then I set about trying to find an answer. And the methodology you asked about was, in that case, I wanted to understand what were correlates. In other words, what else was changing? What else was happening while Islam was becoming a dominant tradition? Now, correlation does not mean causation. So you have to be very careful when you're doing this kind of analysis. But it certainly gives you a hint into what to look for, you know. And so my method then was to look at what else is happening politically, what's happening commercially, what's happening environmentally, what's happening to the rivers, very important, the whole history of the rivers system in Bengal, the largest river complex in the world, is that delta.
How does that add the river part?
Well, the rivers are moving. And in the case of Bengal, you have on the western side over here, the old Ganges, which they say the Adi Ganga, the original Ganges, goes through Calcutta. But then beginning around the 15th to 16th century, that river system began to abandon Calcutta, abandon its westernmost, and move east, and finally end up joining the Brahmaputra way over there by Dhaka. So, and as the river system moved from west to east, the epicenter of population also moved. And fertility of the soil moved. Fertility is very important because that's, as the land becomes more rich, owing to the movement of fresh water, more people come in, which creates a situation of pioneers, hence the frontier idea. Now, I went to school at University of Wisconsin, did my PhD there, and that's also the home of Frederick Jackson Turner, the famous historian of American history, who wrote back in the 1890s his famous frontier thesis.
What is that thesis?
It's called the Frontier Thesis. Frederick Jackson Frontier had this idea, Frederick Jackson Turner had the idea that the American frontier moved from east to west, and that essentially it was an open frontier. He did not notice that there were already American Indians living in this zone. So for him, the frontier was a moving frontier of civilization. And the Indians were simply dislodged from their land, put on the reservations, the American Indians. And so his thesis, with which I profoundly disagree, America was not empty when the white people showed up here, in the 16th century. But the idea of a moving frontier was a very useful one, because that's what I felt I was looking at when I thought about Bengal.
Okay.
The idea of the rivers are moving from west to east,
and people along.
And the people either have to abandon. See, when rivers move, they leave behind stagnant water, and stagnant water brings mosquitoes, and mosquitoes bring malaria, and malaria brings death. So what happens is that the active portion of the delta is moving from those moribund areas where the river has abandoned its former channels, and the whole thing is shifting to the eastern portion of the delta. So that idea of a moving frontier, I took that from Turner, Frederick Jackson Turner. He got that part of it right. But he also made some huge mistakes interpreting American history. But I'm not worried about that. But I thought that was a very, very important insight that he had. And I took that insight and began to think about Bengal in terms of a moving frontier, which was not only political frontier, it was political, it was cultural, in the sense that the frontier is becoming more and more Muslim over time. It's also a ecological frontier, because the land that had been forest is now being transformed into rice paddy. So people who were living in the forest as hunters, gatherers, fishermen, or dry rice cultivation, they are now transformed into wet rice farmers, which is a big change. It's not that people moved from west to east. It's that the people were already in the east, and with the advent of agriculture, the population grew because rice supports a lot more people than hunting does. So I had to integrate all of these different disciplines to understand Islam. And I just want to say one thing about methodology here. I believe that when you're studying something like a cultural phenomenon, like, say, Buddhism or Christianity or Islam, it is not enough simply to look and talk about the religion. You have to see the total context within which that religion is operating. So that's what I was trying to do in the case of Bengal, was to look at the larger picture. And this, of course, comes from the work of Fernand Braudel, the French historian, who was one of the founders of the Annales School of historical scholarship. And his idea was that you need to look at the total society and master many different disciplines to understand the thing. What universities do is they carve up knowledge into little departments.
Yes.
Like a silo.
Specialization.
So oftentimes people don't even talk to each other.
They don't want to generalize.
Exactly.
That leads to very particularization of something, and you miss out on the larger picture. Because you're talking about your book, The Rise of Islam and Bengal Frontier. In that you challenge the dominant theories of Islamization, the idea of religion of the sword, the patronage model. So how does this insight that Islam is moving not just as a frontier, but there is different way in which it developed and located itself in South Asia particularly. So what are you challenging, and what are your core arguments?
As I was doing this research for Bengal, before I even went into the field, I spent about 1.5 years in Bangladesh doing the original research. But before all that, I read a lot of the secondary literature. Okay. Every book I could find that talked about the origins of Islam in Bengal. And they all seemed to talk about one of 3 different theories, each of which I found was not adequate. One of them was that Muslims came in on horseback, waving a sword, and simply conquered Bengal. It's true, the Turks did conquer Bengal in 1206, 1204. But that does not explain religious change. It only explains political change. So the first thing to do was to get rid of that theory. It doesn't work. Another theory was that Muslims simply migrated all the way from Afghanistan or somewhere in North India. But that doesn't work either, because if you look at the DNA information of physical anthropology, these Bengalis have always been Bengalis. They've always been there. And so you can't argue, it's not possible to argue that simply the population moved in from somewhere else. Then you had this idea that pious Sufis coming in and converting everyone. Well, the problem with that is that Sufis are everywhere.
Yes.
And there's no reason why the Sufis of Eastern Bengal should be more pious or more effective than the Sufis of Western Bengal or the Sufis anywhere. And besides, when I look at Sufi literature, I find no evidence of any interest in conversion, contrary to what many people say in both Pakistan and India. I'm afraid they're both...
What was the interest of Sufis then in these places?
Well, I had many different motives. Many of them were there to escape the court, to find solace in solitude, which is, after all, the whole idea of retreating from society is fundamental to Sufism. They were also there, I'm thinking of like Shahabuddin Maneri, who wrote his famous 100 letters, was there to work with people, but not with Hindus, but with Muslims, in terms of advancing their own kind of sense of piety and Islam. But these people were not interested in converting non-Muslims. That was my point. Although everybody says that. You see that in books all the time. Because it sounds plausible. But the problem is there's no evidence for that. So I had to throw that out. And then you have the theory that low-caste Hindus found Islam attractive because it preached equality, which also sounds very plausible. But there's no evidence for that either. We don't have any evidence of, in fact, the population that eventually did become Muslim in Eastern Bengal had not yet already become Hindu.
What does that mean, not yet had already become Hindu?
It means that Bengal was gradually becoming Hindu before the Turks arrived, before Muslims arrived.
Before that, what was the Bengali identity?
That's a very good question. It was very much structured around local folk deities. I mean, people who study religion might call this animism. But the point is, it was not a religiously, textually based religion with scripture. They did not have that. So Buddhism had not yet. Buddhism did have a history in Bengal, to be sure, even in Eastern Bengal. But it seems to have died out for reasons that are still obscure before the Muslims arrived.
The interesting thing you're saying, Dr. Eaton, is that the Hinduization of West Bengal and the Islamization, I mean, the words may be, some other words may be used, but it's happening almost at a similar time and gradually. Or there's a lot.
Gradually, very gradually. Yeah. Well, the Hinduization happened much. Brahmanism had a big head start in Bengal. The whole of Bengal was slower in becoming Hinduized than Upper India, Aryavarta. In other words, Uttar Pradesh, even Bihar. That's true. But I would say that the western half of Bengal had become predominantly Hindu in its social structure, its political structure, by the 13th century, but not the eastern part. So the eastern part was still left, relatively speaking, like a kind of a blank slate.
Tribal, animist, and not much organized, small pool of local deities. Yes, not within the larger fold of Brahminical ecosystem. So that's what was East Bengal, as opposed to West Bengal, which had established norms of...
It did.
Okay.
And West Bengal was also, at that time, the Ganges River was flowing right down the west, not the east. So that was the ecologically active part, as well as the socially more advanced part in terms of its agricultural and social development.
So, the question at root is because people say that Islam expanded by sword or Sufi or conversions. If it is not the case, then how did Islam become such an important force and such a massive force in terms of the sheer number of people that practice that religion? How did Islam actually happen in that region?
This was the big question, of course, which I was trying to answer. Exactly. Well, to answer that, I went into the field, into the Mofassal, the backwoods of Bengal, mainly Bangladesh, but parts of West Bengal too. But I was interested in getting my hands on, and I was lucky, I got my hands on Persian documents dating back to the 1600s, which documented the transfer of jungle land to pioneers. And these pioneers were, the Mughal government was trying to develop the land because they wanted revenue. The Mughals, it's important to always remember, were interested in three things: stability, revenue, and loyalty. They don't care about religion, but they want stability, revenue, and loyalty. And so to do that, they need to cut the jungle, transform the jungle into rice paddy, and then tax it. And you see this happening in the tax records of the Mughals, how the amount of taxation coming out of eastern Bengal increases as you move from the 1600s to the 1700s. And West Bengal declines. And part of the reason for that is the whole river phenomenon I just spoke of. But the broader point is that the Mughals were interested in developing the land, and so they were giving land grants to pioneers who were required to cut a certain segment of jungle using local labor. They had to mobilize the labor and pay the labor. And they also had to build a temple or a mosque. If the pioneer were a Hindu, he builds a temple, little mandir. If the pioneer is a Muslim, he builds a masjid. Why? Again, the Mughals don't care about religion, but they do want stability. And they know that if there is a temple or a mosque, that will serve kind of like a nucleus that will hold the community together. And so, and you see this in every one of these documents. The recipient of a land grant is required to, they locate where the land is. The condition is you have to mobilize the labor. You have to bring the land into cultivation, which will be tax-free for the first number of years. And you have to build a temple or a mosque. Now, it happened that most of these pioneers were Muslim. Therefore, most of the structures that were built on these land grant areas happened to be mosques. I think that's the key, because what that meant was that the first scripturally based religion that these people encountered was either the scriptures of the Brahmins or the scriptures of the Muslims, the Quran, the Hadith, and so forth. It was brought in. The mosque was where these scriptures were patronized, and they become the nucleus of these new communities. So the point is that over time, not only the land was changed from jungle to rice paddy, but the population was gradually changed from tribal local cults to Islam or Hinduism.
Could somebody argue that it was a certain kind of bias through which these land grants were given to Muslims because they were Muslim rulers, and that indirectly leads to the Islamization, because the pioneer builds a mosque and then that mosque teaches the religion. Because people are getting access, all the laborers and everybody, they're getting access to the resources, money to work through that institution, and that institution itself can somebody make that claim?
You could make the claim, but the problem is there's no evidence to support the claim. The evidence we have is that the Hindus had taboos against manual labor. That is, the people who were, by definition, a higher caste. Whereas the Muslims did not have that taboo, the Panus. Therefore, there were more Muslims available to be pioneers. But you're quite right. That's an argument that one could use.
But also the question, Dr. Eaton, who are these original pioneers? Are they?
Right.
What is their origin?
Multiple origins. Some of them had titles like Chowdhury, which means they were already landlords of some kind, right?
So are they converted Muslims, or are they Muslims coming from, Turkey, Mongol, these regions? Who are they? What is the origin of these pioneers?
The names, we do have the names. but we do not have the biographies. So I cannot tell you where they came from. But what I can tell you is, from the name, you know whether they are Hindu or Muslim. You also know whether they are from what I would call kind of the pious gentry, like Haji. They would have titles like that, you know, Sheikh, so-and-so, or Chowdhury, as I said. So some of them were religious figures, others were secular, landlords in this case. So you have a mixture of people who were these pioneers. And the way in which their land grant system worked was also complex. In some cases, you had pioneers who went into the jungle, brought the land into cultivation, and then appealed to the government to give them a grant after they've already done all these things. You have other pioneers who are first given the grant, and then they go into the jungle, and they mobilize the populations, and they bring the land into cultivation after having received the grant. So there's different ways that this works, but the important point, I think, is that in every case, the land was transformed, local labor was mobilized in ways that had never happened before, a religious structure, usually a mosque, was built. And these mosques are not beautiful, you know, marble or stone or even brick structures. They're made of bamboo and thatching. Very simple. So they don't exist today. They're all perishable. And that's an important point, because when I went into this project, when I heard the word masjid, I was thinking of some grand edifice with proper architecture. What I discovered was, and I discovered it by looking at some of the diagrams that are part of these land grants. They would actually show you a picture of the mosque or the temple. And they were not at all spectacular architectural monuments. They were very simple, bamboo and thatching. So that was the solution to another problem I had, which was, if most of the dated mosques are in the West, why then are most of the Muslims in the East? And the solution was that the mosques we're talking about, that were critical in this process, were not the great monuments that were dated, that have a stone with an inscription on it. Those are mainly in the western part of the Delta. The Eastern Delta doesn't have as many of those kinds of mosques, but it does have thousands and thousands of these more humble, simple structures. And they were the ones that seem to have played the pivotal role. They don't exist today.
So how long was this process? So somebody thinks that, okay, this is happening, the grant is given, a military commander or a land that would go there, and then they would start working on, proselytizing community, taking the economic benefit from whatever labor they're contributing. I mean, this is also people what they say, but you talk about gradualism. You talk
Very
about
gradual.
the idea of this is not like an imposition. It's
No.
How does that happen?
Well, it happens very subtly, because these pioneers were not necessarily themselves pious or religious, but they were required to build a mosque. That means they hired an imam and a muezzin, and there would be a qazi, and you have all these institutional affiliated with the mosque. But the pioneer was not necessarily affiliated with the mosque. He just built it. His job was to establish the mosque.
Why could it not have happened that the local tribal religious whatever center was there, it would be built in a way, or it would be engaged in a way that the local tradition remains while the idea of economic...
Well, that's a very good question. The local tradition was not institutionalized. So we don't have structures, and we don't have priesthood. So See, Islam has the advantage of having a ready package where you have the law is already there, the Sharia, you have the mosque and all the institutions that go with the mosque, of course, you know, the imam, the muazzin, the khatib. They're all part of it. They come with the mosque. The same with the temple. You have your functionaries in there, the Brahmin functionaries in the temple.
How does that contribute to this process?
Well,
how does that help?
It helped because it secured an institution that was fixed in space.
Stability.
You have that, it's stability. Remember, one of the three things the Mughals wanted, stability.
Stability, economy.
And revenue and loyalty.
And loyalty.
Yeah, loyalty is important. The last sentence of every land grant would say, you must promise that you will pray for the long life of the empire. There's a de facto separation of religion and state. You must remember, the Mughals were not interested in religion. They absolutely were not. And that includes Aurangzeb. We'll come to him later.
Yes, we will.
But I just want to say that this is very important to bear in mind, that when we talk about the Mughals as being a Muslim dynasty, it's Muslim in a very narrow sense, that Babur was Muslim coming out of, you know, Central Asia, and his successors were also Muslim. But over the course of time, they had assimilated themselves into Indian culture thoroughly, especially Rajput culture. So my point is that by the time Bengal becomes the frontier, which is the middle 1600s, it's already pretty late. That's Aurangzeb's time, right? I mean, it's true. Jahangir established what he called Jahangirnagar, which is Dhaka. But it was really after Jahangir, it was even after Shah Jahan, that we begin to see these changes taking place. So I guess the point I want to make is that the religion that was already there in Eastern Bengal did not have any structure to it. There was no cement. There was no priesthood. There was no book. There was no monuments that we know of. The folk religion was very diffuse, and therefore it had nothing to kind of hold it together. This is why the Mughals wanted to have a mosque or a temple in each of these land grants.
Because it was really difficult to control people in a way.
Control is very important, because frontiers anywhere are by definition turbulent and can always be. I mean, look at the Afghans. When they are expelled from Delhi, where do they go? They go to Eastern Bengal. I'm talking about the period of, you know, right after Babur and Humayun, who chases the Afghans all the way down the Gangetic Plain as far as Dhaka, you know. So the frontier is an area that's by definition unruly. Just like out here in the West, the frontier has always been kind of hard to control. The Wild West.
How are people actually converting? Because of the education, because of the interaction,
I believe that the word conversion is flawed. I don't think they were converting. Conversion connotes a conscious transformation. Yesterday I was that, today I am this. Now that's a kind of a 19th century Protestant model of religious change, you know. That idea of experiencing a complete and total and instantaneous transformation, which certainly does happen, you know, on an individual basis. But when we're talking about a whole society, what I see rather is a gradual transformation which could be documented both by the names for the deity and the names of people, personal names. People begin to adopt Persian or Arabic names. They give their children an Arabic name or Persian name. But it doesn't happen all at once. It happens over hundreds of years. That is to say, a society maybe only 10% have Arabic or Persian names. And then maybe after 100 years, maybe only 40%. and then maybe another 100 years, maybe 80%. So you can see a gradual increase in the relative number of Arabic and Persian personal names. And that reflects religious change, but it happens very slowly.
And what were the reasons for these people to accept Islam?
I think it's the same reason they accepted Hinduism, that the temple or the mosque provided a sense of stability and security in a society that was already mobile. I mean, hunters and fishermen are by definition moving around, whereas farmers are fixed in place. When you're farming land, you have to stay on that land, right? And so by transforming the land to rice paddy, you're now creating cultivators who can't move as easily as they could before. And that's a major transformation in their life, as well as this new religion. And I believe that the people made an association between the change of the land and the change of the religion. I say that because one of the things I noted about many of the Sufis or so-called Sufis of Bengal was that many of them were identified not only with transforming the society to Islam, but they were also associated with being the first farmer, the first cultivator, which means there's a memory of these people as coming in and transforming the land from something that had not been before, transforming it from jungle to rice paddy. So that memory, I think, is very significant. And many of these pioneers, who were not necessarily Sufis themselves, seem to have been retroactively identified as having been Sufis. And a mazar appears over the gravestone.
Because of the reverence that people had for them?
Yes, I think respect and reverence and veneration. There's a recognition that this person was an important person in transforming the land.
And that necessarily, that person does not have to be Sufi in the traditional way that the word Sufism...
Exactly. I think that's a very good point. So I guess what I'm trying to say, in a nutshell, is that the rise of Islam, in my understanding, was almost a kind of byproduct of a larger transformation of both the land and society and the economy. You could throw in politics too, because after all...
Which includes an empire, in a sense.
It was the Mughal government that was issuing the land grants. So they had to be there. So the Mughals did play a role by initiating the process of the land transformation.
Because we're talking about Sufism, and Sufism in your work in Sufism in Bijapur. So you talk about Sufism not just as this abstract ideal of some Sufi saint who is sitting in a dargah, or in somewhere reclusive, and practicing whatever spirituality he believes in. So, but the Sufi is somebody who's engaging in the daily life. He's interacting. He's communicating. What is in that? So, how do you see this? Sanitized version of what Sufism people put forward, and the way Sufis actually acted in real space and time.
Right. Yes, I think you're referring to my first book on Bijapur.
Yes.
I wrote that book after having spent a long time in Hyderabad, because I wanted to understand conversion. This word that I no longer like to use. But I wanted to understand, how do people change religion? Why, when, and where? And before I went into the field, before I went to India for the first time, everybody told me that, well, if you want to study conversion to Islam, then you should be studying the Sufis, because that's what they do. They're very holy. They're very humanity, very generous. They transcend. So I said, that's fine. I'll do that. So I went to Hyderabad, And the first Persian book that I found, the Persian manuscript rather, on the Sufis of Bijapur, was a Persian Tazkara. It was simply called the Tazkara-e Awliya-e Bijapur. And I read that Persian manuscript. I have it right here, by the way, in my study. I can show it to you. I had it transcribed into legible Persian so that I could read it. There's no interest by anyone in converting Hindus to Islam. So I had to give up on that idea of looking to Sufis in order to explain conversion. So I changed my mind. I changed my agenda. And I decided to write about what the Sufis were doing. Reading them as social actors, what were they doing in society? And there's no single answer. Some of them were advisors to the court. They were brought into court of Sultan Ali al-Shah, Ibrahim al-Shah, Muhammad al-Shah. They were part of the court scene on the assumption that if we can make the Sultan a more pious person, this will help the whole society. Other Sufis were just the opposite. They got as far from the court as they could. There's a hill in Bijapur called Shahpur Hillock, which is where there's a very important dargah of Aminuddin Allah out there. Where he was trying to establish himself away from the court and just meditate and do Chishti, he was a Chishti Sufi, exercises out there. And then you have other Sufis who become landlords. They accept land from the government and they become proprietors of huge land estates. I didn't expect that.
The Sufi to have this wealth.
Very huge wealth, yeah.
The traditional expectation is of renunciation, leaving everything behind.
Exactly, and that too. You have some of these darvish or majzub is the word they would use in Arabic. The ones who are attracted to God and are kind of, antisocial or asocial, and known as leading very kind of lives that are separated from society. So I had all these different social roles, and I wanted to understand why do you find certain social roles at this period of time and not that period of time. So that's why I wrote that book. I was trying to understand. I was trying to, as you said earlier, see the Sufis not simply as mystics, but also as social actors.
So today, even in the modern Indian context, what sometimes we see is that sanitized version of Sufism is seen as used in a good Muslim, bad Muslim trope. So this version of Islam is bad, this version of... And in a way, all of it at that point of time, it was not as developed as people are retrospectively theorizing certain traditions. So also, Dr. Eaton, you've also written about this idea you mentioned earlier also about the Turks. The Turks like the Gurjars and the Vangas, they're also people who are immigrating from which is whatever territorially known as India today. And people, when that is happening, this change over almost a millennia and more, people have been moving across. So this idea of you being foreign or you being, the other, the invader, was not that prominent in the local vocabulary or the vocabulary of the time.
What time are you referring to?
It is in the Middle Ages.
Okay.
Not today.
No, okay.
When this process of change, the land change, the ecology change, people changing their views about things due to different processes. So at that point, there was no constructed reality of as an invader, as an outsider. How did it come about, and how did people perceive these people, Mughals, Turks? How did they perceive the local people or the indigenous people? even the Hindus or the Brahmins, what was their understanding of what is happening at that time?
Well, if you're referring to the initial conquest of Upper India, say you go back to the Rhetoric conquest, 1192, right, which then opens the door for Turkish invasions throughout Upper India. Okay, that was a disaster for both the politics of Upper India and for the Brahmins, because the Brahmins were patronized by the court. And a lot of these dynasties were simply crushed in a very short period of time, between 1192 and the next 50, 60 years, actually. For the common people, I don't think, of course, they don't write memoirs, so it's very difficult to know what they thought. But from what we know is that not much changed, except that India was brought into wider global commercial nexus as a consequence of the conquest. And so for merchants, it was definitely not a disaster. For banyas across India, the connection with the Middle East brought in a huge amount of silver and investments, so that banking takes off. And the giants who were already active in banking become servants of these dynasties, these sultanates. The Delhi Sultanate was only the largest of them, but you have sultanates in Jaunpur, Gujarat, the Deccan, Bengal, Kashmir, and so forth. And they all become important. They all become important sites of commercial exchange and commercial growth. So cities appear, which were not there before. So a lot is changing. But to answer your question, it depends on who you're asking. For the small number of Maharajas, the conquest was a disaster because they're thrown out of power. And for the Brahmins who served them, it was a disaster. But moving beyond those categories of society, certainly the cultivators and the merchants sectors, it was probably a net gain, positive, if we think about,
Even when we do economic history of India, we find that it is during this period that the GDP of India was almost 24% of the global output. And maybe it is because of this global connection which emerged.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah, India has always been wealthy, but now it becomes more integrated with the rest of the world after the 12th century.
Your recent works, which is very influential, India in the Persianate Age. So what you're saying, the globalization and the cosmopolis, the Persianate cosmopolis that is becoming, in a sense, because the rulers or the people who are coming, they have a certain, descent. And there is an India in making, which is at the intersection and interaction of different cultures fusing together. So what do you mean by this, Persianate Age?
I have to go back a little bit here. I was commissioned by Penguin Books in London to write a survey of Indian history from the 12th century to the coming of the British. And I agreed. And then I had to figure out how do I do this? The usual story is that, the 12th century is the coming of Islam. And then we have this long period of time, 6 or 7 centuries, when India is dominated by Muslim rulers. And that, in turn, sets up this whole trope of Hindu versus Muslim. And the temptation, therefore, to see the South Asian past through the lens of religion. I think that was largely a function of historiography of the 19th century, the way the British were teaching history. You know, James Mill famously divided up history into early, medieval, and modern, which is an old European trope, goes back to the Renaissance. But that idea of dividing between ancient, medieval, and modern was then projected onto India, and they simply filled in the slots with Hindu, Buddhist for the ancient, Muslim for the medieval, and British for the modern.
And not interestingly, Christianity. It's British.
Right, because they thought themselves to be above religion.
While they're not giving that same analysis to the Mughals, the way you are interpreting that the religious part is not administrative.
Well, this is precisely why I wrote the book. That's why I called it India in the Persianate Age instead of India in the Muslim age. Because I realized that what happened owing to the British colonial period and the Indian nationalist period that followed that.
Just before that, Dr. Eaton, because the Persia was a Muslim Persia at that point, at that time, what does it mean? What is the difference between the Persianate age and a Muslim age? What is
it means everything. Muslim means religion. Persian means language. So I took this idea from Shelley Pollock in his book, in his idea on the Sanskrit cosmopolis, where he talks about the Sanskrit language being the vehicle for Sanskrit literature. And Sanskrit literature as something that embraces basic ideas of how society is built and sustained. Having to do with courtly comportment, acquisition of power, how to write a poem, architecture. Sanskrit literature is a huge ocean of many different things. And what Pollock is talking about is an elite language which was not regional, like Gujarati or Bengali or Kashmiri, which are only spoken in those particular regions, but rather Sanskrit is a language that is above, it's trans-regional. It cuts over and above these regional languages, which enabled it to move all the way from eastern Afghanistan, across South Asia, into Southeast Asia, as a result of which you have words like Kandahar, Afghanistan, which is Sanskrit, and of course Sumatra or Singapore, which is also Sanskrit. And so he's talking about, in other words, a world that is held together by a linguistic and, more properly speaking, literary phenomenon of not just a religion. Sanskrit also carries religion, obviously. Think of the Vedas and the whole tradition of, Sanskrit religious literature. I don't mean to leave religion out. I'm just saying that Sanskrit embraces much more than religion. In the same way, Persian embraces much more than Islam. It's what you say is correct. Iran was predominantly Islamic, certainly by the 12th century, easily. Earlier, before that actually, but by the time all this comes to India, Iran was thoroughly Muslim. But that does not mean that the Persian language carries only Islamic sensibility. If you speak of Sufism, it's hard to imagine Sufism without Persian. I agree with that. But the reason that Persian survived in Iran and did not get overwhelmed by Arabic, which happened everywhere else, is that Persian was not a sacred language in Iran by this time. It was not liturgical. It was a language of power. It was a language of trans-regional trade. It was a language of...
So it was too much to replace it. The cost of replacing a language, because it was already covering a lot of, different societies.
Exactly.
So it was too high to be Arabized. Because Persia has a longer history. I mean, it has its own...
Absolutely, and especially in the area of administration. I mean, the Achaemenid dynasty of ancient Persia, I'm speaking of Cyrus and Darius. At that time, you had a specialized body of clerks whose business it was, professional class of bureaucrats who knew how to collect taxes, who knew how to impose taxes, who knew how to run the revenue system, which every empire has to have. The Arabs had no experience of this at all. As they go off marching all over the place, conquering these people, they had no tradition of empire. Persia did. So Persian comes to India as a language that is already equipped with administrative and bureaucratic capacity, which every political power wants to have. Akbar declares it the official language of India, in 1582, precisely because he knew that Persian already has this capacity for governance. Again, the Mughals are interested in loyalty, revenue, and stability. And the stability comes from having a revenue system that will operate. So Persian was the language of administration, but it was also the language of classical poetry, not necessarily religious. So what I'm coming to here is that I took the idea from Shelley Pollock of imagining a world that's informed by Sanskrit, stretching all the way from Afghanistan to Singapore. And I simply took Persian and applied that idea to the Persian language, which has a huge geographical reach from the Balkans through Turkey, Central Asia, South Asia, and really all the way to China. Persian was the official language used all along the Silk Road to China.
Can this be argued, Dr. Eaton, that rather than religion, so it then becomes a struggle of linguistic cultural expansion? So when Sanskrit is not the origin language of, say, Afghanistan, when you say, so it's expanding. Similarly, Persian is expanding. Arabic language is expanding. So in that way, the idea of Hinduism not being completely local, territorially speaking, is not as true as it is being made out today in the sense of the Sanskrit cosmopolis.
Basically, what Shelley Pollock is saying about Sanskrit, what I'm saying about Persian, is that these two literary traditions are fundamentally secular. Of course, they can carry religion too, and they do. But it is not exclusively religion.
Oh, I get what you're saying.
It carries a lot more with that. And the reason I chose the word Persianate age was I wanted to find a way of thinking about pre-colonial India without privileging religion. Because my argument would be that certainly ever since 1947, when the British leave, India and Pakistan both needed a way to justify the partition. How do you justify the partition? Well, if you talk to a Pakistani, it's justified from the minute that Muhammad bin Qasim arrives in Sindh in the year 711, 712, and that they even teach in Pakistan, if I'm not mistaken, that Muhammad bin Qasim was the first Pakistani. And my point is here,
it's a reconstructed past. Because
you're totally reconstructing it. And so the urge to legitimate or justify or to explain the partition drove both Hindus and Muslims to look at religion and to imagine that there had always been
this kind of
conflict between Hindus and Muslims. So in a sense, religious conflict was read into the past, projected into the past, by way of anticipating what would happen in 1947.
That this were to happen because...
That's right. In other words, it's almost like imagining that all of South Asian history was simply a prologue to the partition of 1947, which is, of course, absolutely false. But that's the kind of mentality that people are maybe subconsciously or unconsciously thinking.
Also, we see this shift from Persian to Urdu. We see the shift from Latin to English. We see the shift from Sanskrit to Hindi. This happens, whatever the language was of a certain region became the cosmopolis language. But within that context also, being a Hindu from Sanskrit to Hindi, being a Muslim from Persian to Urdu, how does that happen? I mean, and especially in the colonial policy, especially with reference to Persian to Urdu, what is happening? How is happening? And what is it achieving? And what is it changing?
I think one of the tragedies of our current times is the identification of language with religion. That absolutely was not the case in the Mughal period, when you had, these documents I was referring to that I read in Bengal, these Persian documents were written by Hindu
Brahmins,
or kayasths, possibly, clerks, who learned the language simply because it was a job.
Bureaucracy.
And it was the administrative language. It had nothing to do with religion. And they understood that, so no problem learning Persian. The same with the British, they bring English with them.
It's like we speak English.
Exactly. So there was there was no association between Persian and Islam in the minds of the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of kayasths and Brahmins and so forth who learned Persian and were in the system. I mean, Guru Nanak's father was a clerk, a low clerk in the Persian bureaucracy. Like probably millions of others used Persian, not necessarily speaking it, but reading and writing. So that's my point. Persian was understood as a religion-neutral language.
Also, language, because as you rightly argued and articulated, also embodies its culture and civilization. Language also personifies in certain ways in which the civilization developed, its vocabulary. So how did this language, which became the Persian cosmopolis in a sense, and India became part of it, how did it contribute to the Indian civilization or at that point of time? What did it change?
Well, the language didn't change, but India sure changed.
How?
If that's what you mean. Well, because Persian brings with, just like Sanskrit transforms Cambodia or Sumatra, because it informs the architecture, it informs the diet, the cuisine, it informs the vernacular language. Javanese, for example, there's a lot of Sanskrit in it. And the same with Persian. When Persian comes to India, it's the Persian language that informs things like music. I have on my wall back here, on the wall is a tar, the tar is a Persian instrument, which is an ancestor of the sitar. Sitar simply means three strings. Guitar, also in the Western world. So that idea, which is a Persian idea, has moved all over the world, across the Silk Road. Persian brings with it a sensibility dealing with dress and clothing. So you have styles of dress that are associated with the language. Same with food, cuisine.
So it could be said that because there's a lot of mobility because of this common...
Tremendous mobility. People are moving around all the time.
And so they're bringing cultures from here to there,
Right.
there to here. And it is translating into even architecture, even poetry, music, interaction, even cultural exchange, leading to new forms of engagements. So, but why did Persian, it moved from Persian to Urdu when it was the state language? How did that happen?
A very slow process, and there's still debates about the exact engineering of it all, but there's no doubt that Persian was I should put it this way, there's no doubt that the people in the Mughal court were bilingual. We know this because we know exactly how For example, the Ramayana was translated from Sanskrit to Persian.
Only a bilingual can do that.
And the same with the Mahabharata, was translated under Akbar and Jahangir. They both were active in patronizing the translations between these two trans-regional languages, Sanskrit and Persian. But the medium, the language that was used, I mean, the Persian speakers did not know Sanskrit. And the Sanskrit teachers or speakers did not know Persian, but they both knew Hindavi, which was simply a word meaning the local language. It doesn't mean Hindi. It means the local language. So Persian writers might use the word Hindavi when they're referring to Telugu in South India or Kannada. My point is here that there was already a vernacular language that was being spoken among everybody. It's just that some were bilingual with Persian, others were bilingual with Sanskrit. And we actually have paintings of these interlocutors. You have these Brahmins, you have pundits who speak Sanskrit and Hindavi, and then you have Persian scholars who know both Persian and Hindavi. So Hindavi becomes the link between the two. This meant that inevitably, Urdu would absorb a great deal of Persian because the same people are using that language. Or I say Urdu, I mean Hindavi. Now, the word Urdu is a later term, as you know, that comes up in the late Mughal period. But it simply refers to the local language of the Delhi region, Braj. So it's an interesting phenomenon. Persian does decline, no doubt about it, by the time we get into the late 19th century, 20th century. By that time, the Mughal Empire is gone. The patronage network is gone. The administrative system is gone. All the structure that kept Persian as a vital language used for many things, as a courtly language, as an administrative language, all that disappeared after 1858. So that inevitably brought about the decline of Persian, even though it was still, and is today, admired and respected and venerated as a very important literary mode, especially in poetry.
Dr. Eaton, if we look at this framework of the Persianate and we see what is happening in India in the Hindutva paradigm of claiming everything which the Muslim practices or the Muslim history as something which is alien to this territory, to this region. So before we were discussing about how there is the indigenization of or the localization of the Muslims in the Indian context, and because what we are arguing is a lot of import, as if it seems like everything is imported. So does it lead to some level of weaponization by Hindutva, or how do we articulate it in a sense?
You're quite right. Hindutva has succeeded in weaponizing the whole Mughal period. As you're probably aware, the teaching of Mughal history has disappeared entirely in certain grades of the national curriculum today, and has been minimized in other grades. So there's a gradual sense of all that disappearing, or at least declining. I think the problem is ultimately that history has been weaponized, not just language. And when the Prime Minister speaks of 1,200 years of slavery, Baraso Salgi Golami, he's referring to 10 centuries of Islamic rule and 2 centuries of British rule, both of them seen as equally foreign, which is a huge mistake. It's true that in 1948, the British had the good sense to leave India. But obviously, the Muslim community is very much alive and well and still there, which is a problem for this idea of 12 centuries of slavery, right? What I would say is that this whole framework needs to be re-examined. What it ignores is the degree to which not only the Mughal Empire, but the Delhi Sultans had become deeply invested in Indian culture, Indian society, Indian language, Indian notions of kingship, all of this, to such an extent that the Mughal Empire, in my view, was virtually a Rajput state. I know that will alarm people.
Please expand this.
But
expand this idea.
Well, let's take the fact that when Akbar began to make alliances with the various Rajput houses in Rajasthan, he's bringing to the court not only the Maharajas, who, by the way, are allowed to continue remaining sovereign over their home territory, as you know, the Watan Jagir. But they also, the princesses, the women, come into the Mughal harem. And as this happens, and very importantly, unlike the Ottoman Empire, in the Ottoman case, if you're going to become a state servant, you have to convert to Islam. Not Mughals. You stay, if you're a Rajput, you stay being a Hindu. That's fine. These Rajput women were coming into the harem, and these Rajput women remain Rajput, Hindu, of course, and they have the status of full wives of the emperor. So Akbar's son Salim is the son of a Hindu Rajput woman. When Salim becomes Emperor Jahangir, he marries a number of Hindu wives, one of whom becomes the mother of Shah Jahan. So biologically speaking, the Mughal dynasty is becoming more Rajput. Now, as we all know, we are all raised by our mothers. You speak your mother tongue, not your father's tongue, in every language, this is what they say. And these Rajput women in the Mughal harem transformed the harem largely into a culturally Rajput space. So that as children were raised in this harem, right? All the children were. So the children were raised in a space that was fundamentally Rajput. The language, of course, was part of this package. And what I'm trying to say is that many of the political customs that the Mughals adopt are purely Rajput. The idea of the Jaraka, for example, the space where in the balcony that projects out from the palace, where the Maharaja or the Sultan or the Emperor sits above the ground, overlooking the people. And it actually begins with Humayun. He was the first Mughal emperor to establish this idea of the Charaka among the Mughals. It was a Rajput custom where the Rajput king would be seated almost like an icon, like a murti. And it borrows a great deal from the whole idea of Hindu worship, where the icon is connected to the worshiper, darshan. It's exactly what happens in the Jaraka. The Jaraka, beginning with Humayun, who every morning gets up, faces east, the rising sun. As the sun brightens up his face, he is reflecting his own countenance to the people below, in the same way that a Hindu king would present himself to his people. It's institutions like this that I think most dramatically illustrate the degree to which the Mughals became profoundly Indian. You see it in language, and especially, as I say, through biology. These kings were not, the amount of Turkish blood diminishes every generation, to the point that they are indistinguishable from any other Indian.
Also, Dr. Eaton,
right?
Because you highlighted the fact that these customs of Rajput, Rajputana legacies of rulings or rulers like this sun basking from a higher elevated plane.
Right.
So it was adopted in the Mughal context. But does
Humayun in that case.
Humayun in that case, but does it necessarily also take away the Islamic sort of values that Mughals may be representing at the same time, or is it some of those elements that
it's just added on.
It's just added on.
It's not a zero-sum game.
That's what I'm trying to think about when you're saying it. So it's not a zero-sum game.
No.
So it's like some level of adaptations of some things which portrays power, hierarchy, and maybe still able to retain some of the legacy that comes from their own heritage.
Absolutely. I mean, all of these emperors were patronizing Sufi silsilas everywhere. Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh equally patronized the Qadri and the Chishti and the Suhrawardi orders. Both of them did.
So, one of your very, widely cited articles or essay, Temple Desecration and Muslim States. So that creates what the modern or the contemporary narrative from the Hindutva is about the way that the temple desecration happened. And that creates the weaponization of history as we are continuing. And you mentioned about Aurangzeb, you mentioned about Dara Shikoh. What is the difference, historically speaking, what happened and the way this narrative, which is Hindutva, the way it is weaponizing all of this idea of a temple below the mosque, and why all of these mosques then needs to be erased to reclaim that past identity. So what is truth and what is myth about all of this narrative which is happening right now in India?
Well, this is one of the great tragedies, as I see it. What's happening today is a complete misunderstanding of what actually happened in the Indian past with respect to temples. I began studying the whole question of temple desecration in the year 2000. About 1996 when I was in Washington, D.C. That was already 4 years after the Babri Masjid had been destroyed. And people were saying, well, this is only one mosque. What's one mosque? After all, the Muslims have been wiping out temples by the thousands. What's wrong with one mosque? The Babri Masjid, it's only one. And that provoked me to think about, well, gee, is it really true? The thousands of the temples were being destroyed by Muslim sultans and generals and whatnot. So I decided to do something which I discovered no one else had even asked, which is, what is the evidence? I mean, in history, you have to go where the evidence takes you. So I immersed myself in Epigraphia Indica, this multi-volume thing going back all the way back to the late 19th century when the British published all these epigraphs, inscriptions, to learn according to the inscription evidence, because that's the closest we're going to have to a smoking gun. When you have a inscription saying that I, Sultan Falan Falan, destroyed a temple at this site, and gives a date, and you know the context that happened in. Well, that's evidence. That's very important. Chronicles are also evidence if they're contemporary, but they're not quite as reliable as inscriptions, in my view, because oftentimes chroniclers are trying to please their patrons.
Please differentiate between chronicles and the evidence that you're...
The typical chronicle is a narrative account of the doings of a court, which is in turn patronizing the chronicler. So the chronicler is being paid to write things, good things, usually, about the sultan, the emperor, whatnot. That's the reason I'm more suspicious of chronicles than I am of inscriptions. A chronicler, in order to please his patron, might claim that Sultan so-and-so went out and destroyed 25 temples before breakfast. something outlandish like this. Won't even identify where they were. So you have to be very careful with chronicles. But inscriptions, I think, are more reliable. So when I wrote my article...
What is an inscription?
Inscription is a tablet, usually on the face of a monument, where it is inscribed the name of the patron, the builder, the date in which it was built. Sometimes it will, the purpose of what it's for. If it's a mosque, it will oftentimes quote from the Quran about the piety of the patron. But the important thing is they're always contemporary with the event. And that's so true today. You go to any building on this campus where I am at here, and there'll be a cornerstone with a date on it. This hasn't changed. And that's my point. So when I began doing research on this question of temple desecration, I went straight to the inscriptional evidence, much of which was in the Epigraphia Indica, which is this huge compendium of inscriptions in all languages, not just Persian, not just Sanskrit, but vernacular languages as well. And I looked up, it took a lot of work to go through all this, to see exactly what temples were desecrated or destroyed, when, where, by whom, and in what context. I needed to answer all those questions to the extent possible. And then the next thing was to put them in chronological order, starting with 1192 right down to the end of the Mughal period, and look for patterns. Is there a pattern? So I did that, and there was a pattern. I discovered immediately that the temple desecrations followed the army, the Turkish army, as it moved from Afghanistan southeast down the Gangetic Plain all the way to Bengal. And then, after that was accomplished, it moved through Rajasthan into Gujarat, and from Gujarat southeast into the Deccan, again with armies. So in other words, what we're looking at is the cutting edge of a moving military frontier. Now that struck me as amazing. It's obviously patterned, because you can look at the political history and you can see how the temple desecration followed that exactly. No one had ever noticed that before. Now I'm trying to explain why is that the case? Then I realized that the temples being desecrated were almost in every instance temples that were identified with an enemy king. Now in Hindu political thought, it is the deity that's sovereign, not the Raja. The Raja only serves the deity. The deity, and you can still, even today, you can go to big temples like the Meenakshi temple in Madurai, where the deity will literally be taken out and given a tour around the city, as if the Maharaja, or Maharani in this case, is out seeing her realm. It is not the king that's sovereign, it's the deity. So the king has to build a spectacular temple housing the murti, the image of the patron god or goddess. Typically Shaiva, but oftentimes Vaishnavite. The Muslims understood that if that temple, that royal temple, is destroyed or desecrated in any way, it has been separated from the Maharaja. So the Maharaja has lost his connection with sovereign authority. In other words, destroying the enemy's army is not enough. Removing the king from power, from his throne, is not enough. What you really have to do is to attack the temple, which is patronizing the state deity, or the Rashtra Devata in Sanskrit. Interestingly enough, this did not begin with the Turks. Hindu kings had been desecrating one another's temples since at least the 6th century. And I have a long list of those, where the Chalukyas are bashing the Cholas.
And are taking the example of how in India, rulers used to conquer other.
It's part of conquest. You have this, the Digvijaya, right? The conquest of the quarters, where you go around northeast, southwest. Fundamental to that process is the business of destroying or desecrating the temple of a defeated Maharaja. Typically, in the pre-Muslim case, the pre-Turkish case, you would find Maharajas bringing back the murti to their home as a trophy and installing it somewhere in their own capital. Rajendra Chola did this against the Bengal Maharajas and the Pala kings of Bengal. Literally came up and took the murti back to Tamil Nadu, about 1,000 miles away. The point I'm making is that what the Turks began doing as soon as they arrived in India in 1192 was simply following a pattern, a custom that was already ingrained in Indian political practice. There was nothing new about this. Desecrating temples is what you do if you want to make sure the king has been defeated. I found another pattern in this exercise, and that was that once territory had been consolidated, no more temples are destroyed, unless a political authority who had previously succumbed or sworn allegiance, loyalty is the word, again, who had previously sworn loyalty to the Sultanate or the Mughal, if that chieftain or king or whatever he is rebels against the state authority, his temple, which he patronizes, is going to be destroyed. Otherwise, the temple is regarded as state property and must not be touched. Muhammad bin Tughlaq is a great example of this. He invades the Deccan in the early 14th century, and as he's invading the Deccan, he destroys the temples of ruling kings. He completely levels the great temple of Swayambhu Shiva in Warangal, which was the state temple to the Kakatiya dynasty. And you can still see it today. It's just ruins, rubble in the middle of Warangal. But once the land has become part of sovereign territory of the Delhi Sultanate, Hindu temples are not only permitted and allowed and preserved, they are reconstructed when they're falling apart. They're patronized. In other words, the same king, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the same one who destroys the great temple of Swayambhu Shiva when it was an enemy state, has now become the patron who's overseeing the reconstruction and repair made to another temple dedicated also to Shiva, by the way, in Kalyana, after he's Sultan. So it's all up to context. If you are an enemy, or if you are a former enemy but now loyal, but then rebel, then not only you're going to be in trouble of losing your life, but your temple will be in trouble. So I came to the conclusion, it seems to me obvious, that temples are profoundly political institutions. It's where sovereign authority is established, reconfirmed, and contested. And this is a pattern that long precedes the arrival of Muslim Turks.
So, while listening to you, a question just popped up in my mind. What does it say about Hinduism in the sense that before the Turks are desecrating the temples for political gains, we're arguing that the Hindus amongst themselves are already doing that. So in the larger context of Hinduism as a hierarchy and a story of multiple deities being connected to each other, so what does it say about Hinduism at that point when Hindus recognizing that, whether they recognize or not, that is the question. How is Hinduism seen from the eye of a Hindu king? when they're destroying other people, other temple. At the end of the day, the temple represents a certain level of Hindu piety. Maybe it is a piety from a perspective of a different Hindu king. But what does that mean as a lived experience?
I can only say this, that I've come across no cases where a village temple was even touched by anyone, Hindu or Muslim, because they have no political meaning. They have no political significance. To the king, to come to your question, it means the source of his legitimacy. He's no longer in power if his sovereign deity has been taken away.
Also, when you said that the Persianate language itself is secular, in that context, if I try to take your own framework and put it in the Hindu political context. So the idea, because it's not, if Hinduism were to dominate as an ideology from the perspective of statehood, then even destroying each other's temple would have been extremely difficult because they're part of a larger, religious identity. But if that's happening, so in a way, even the Hindu kings at some level are acting in whatever secular framework they understand. So it's not the way that, Shivaji Maharaj is interpreted as the Hindu king. I mean, the Hindu king that embodies all of Hindu masculinity from the political perspective. So even the way Hinduism is interpreting each other, it may be wildly different from the way it is reconstructed right now.
Oh, absolutely. With one exception. And this is a very tentative hypothesis on my part, but I was intrigued by the recent construction of this elaborate mandir in Ayodhya, the Ram Mandir.
Yes.
Because, if I'm not mistaken, the bricks, the concept that were made to build this grand edifice were collected from, supposedly, from each and every village of India.
Yes, that's true.
Meaning that unlike all temples that I know of in modern Indian history, this one is coming very close to the same kind of Rashtra Devata idea that had characterized pre-Islamic India, right? Where you have a single deity, a single state, a single Maharaja who patronizes that deity and the temple in which the deity is located. So this is a new idea. It's not new, it's very old, but it's new and recent in modern Indian history.
And the multiplicity of, polytheism and this, it is the political monism. So the idea of a political center for a tradition that is widely fragmented in terms of their own, theology, constructs a political theology. And by taking away this bricks from everywhere, it is the emotions of all of Indians collectively constructing a political theology.
Exactly. In one sense, it's a novel idea because it hasn't happened in a couple centuries. In another sense, it's an ancient idea. The idea of a single God and a single temple and a single state. Yeah, so it's a really interesting phenomenon, and I don't know how that's going to play out, but that's what I noticed when I saw that Ram Mandir go up.
Also, Dr. Eaton, tell us a little more about also the temple grants. I mean, while all of this is happening, the same Mughal rulers or other rulers, they're also patronizing or giving patronage to some local temple, like they're giving to mosques. So it is not as if it's not a reductive phenomena of only one kind of activities happening. It's a dynamic relationship between the Hindu population.
Exactly. This is what makes an empire an empire. An empire, by definition, in my view, is multicultural, multilinguistic. And you're bringing all these people, the only thing they have in common is they're all paying taxes to the same, overlord, right? That means that the overlord has to be nice to everybody and has to dole out. I mean, the same thing happened in China. The Qing emperor, to the Buddhists, he was a bodhisattva. To To the Confucian Chinese, he was a sage. And it's fascinating how this works, because Akbar began doing exactly the same thing. He wants to appear to be legitimate in the eyes of whoever is viewing him, right? And I think that's the game you're playing, and this is why it's a mistake, as we keep hearing, that the Mughals were a Muslim dynasty, as if it was only for Muslims and was made up only of Muslims. That's absolutely not true, and which is why I'm so concerned that the teaching of Mughal history is being curtailed, if not abolished.
You might be aware of something which happened recently. So something happened, and a movie was released called Chhawa, and which featured Aurangzeb and his cruelty and barbaric, way he killed Hindu leaders, and that led to in I think Aurangabad, where Aurangzeb's grave is, it led to the attempt of desecrating it, and it also led to some riots in Nagpur and other regions. So it also brings up to the question, because you mentioned Akbar, and you also mentioned that Mughal is an administrative unit in a sense of a polity, in a sense of an empire. And as much as it has, some level of Islam infused in that empire, it also has the ways and systems to engage with the plural nature of this country. What the empire, the region they were ruling. So it, in a way, is also secular. Oh, yeah. So when we see right now the binary between how Akbar and Aurangzeb is seen, and you've mentioned that even Aurangzeb, for that matter, who had larger personal piety when compared to Akbar, in the standard way in which people understand Islamic piety to be. But even then, you argue that largely speaking, they were modern projects, both of them, modern projects of
in different
power,
ways.
In different ways. So in what ways are they similar, and in what ways are they different?
That's a great question. I consider both Akbar and Aurangzeb to have been very innovative and, dare I use the word, modern. Now, people like to debate about what we mean by modernity. And I'm not going to go too far down in the weeds of all of that. But I will say that at least two features that characterize these respective emperors follow what we conventionally think of when we hear the word modernity. In the case of Akbar, it's making the government efficient. He doesn't want corruption. And what struck me most interesting about Akbar is that he had a mechanical clock in Fatehpur Sikri, one of his capitals, where that clock would govern the workday of all the courtiers in the precincts. And then, of course, you have the Ain Akbari by Abul Fazl, which specifies, that's not just a question of laying out and measuring each acre of land or bigha of land, and knowing what products are being produced where. But it's the minutia of how many bushels of grain the imperial camels will receive, and who does that, and what punishment happens if he does not do that. So you can go to the long list of the kind of things that
it's like
Akbar's
a modern
doing.
nation state.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Accounted
Exactly.
And
there are accountants and audits who are checking on everything to make the government efficient. Aurangzeb had a very different understanding of modernity, or a different behavior, which I would call equally modern. And that is, he rejected the model of sovereignty that he had inherited. It goes all the way back to Timur. So you go to Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, his father. They all had this idea of the sacred emperor. That, and in Akbar's case, it was actually a millennial emperor for a while. And the idea being that the king is somehow above all the population because they have a certain spark of divinity in them. There is a sacred
It's the divine
element.
king idea. It's
Divine king. And Aurangzeb completely rejected that.
Interesting.
As part of his argument with his own father, who, and there's a huge story about the tension between the prince, Aurangzeb, and the father, Shah Jahan. I mean, the father kept sending them off on military expeditions because he knew that of his four sons, he was the most capable commander. But that's not the point I want to make. The point I want to make is that more important than simply Aurangzeb's military competence and the trust that he engendered among all of his generals. I mean, it's no secret, no wonder that he defeated his older brother, Dara Shikoh. All these Rajput generals knew that Aurangzeb was the one you want to support because he's the one who is the better administrator, better commander, whereas Dara Shikoh was completely hopeless as a practical, commander or anything. He was a great free thinker, fair enough, but the point I'm going to make is that what Aurangzeb established when he comes into power was he wanted to replace the idea of a sacred king with the idea of law as being above everybody.
The rule of law.
The rule of law. And what he does is patronize the publication of the
Fatwa-i-Alamgir.
Alamgiri. It's about 7 or 8 year, 9 year project. Dozens of
Codification of Sharia.
ulama scholars are huddled together to codify this thing, which had been a hodgepodge that was administered in very different ways in different parts of the empire. And it absolutely was used probably by Hindus more than it was by Muslims, which is fascinating. Because, this is, we all know the Sharia encompasses everything, right? And there's space there for Hindus to have their own civil affairs adjudicated through the Sharia, as anyone else would do, whether it has to do with inheritance or property questions or rental issues, all these mundane things that we all have to deal with. That was all done by the Ghazi.
We often discuss this idea, and I'm connecting even the thing that you said about the rule of law and the sovereignty. So there is this idea of sovereignty of God that is coming from even ancient perspective. But in the Islamic understanding of sovereignty of God is not the way, you're representative of the sovereignty of God in a single person, which is divine from the perspective of being a ruler. That is what you're saying is being negated.
Sacred kingship is being negated, exactly. Let me say one thing to expand on that idea, which is that unlike any other emperor, Aurangzeb established a separate core or group of judges who were allowed to deal exclusively with anyone's complaint against Aurangzeb personally. Okay. If anything you think that I did wrong, you're going to take it to this judge, and I'm going to be held accountable. It's because I am under the law.
I'm
not above the law,
yeah.
Which is what all these sacred people were from Timur on and back doing. And that is a radical idea. I mean, it's ironic that right now we're seeing the whole question of, in this country, United States, where there might be people who are above the law, which I'll not name. But I see this idea of law as being something that's above the people. It goes back to the Magna Carta in English history, 13th century. And I think that in Aurangzeb, one finds a similar kind of phenomenon. And he doesn't get credit for this. To the contrary, Aurangzeb is the one ruler that every Hindu loves to hate for reasons they don't really understand.
The idea that struck me was the idea of rule of law and the ruler being below the below law, but also this idea that you mentioned that there were personal codes and the personal allowed for people, for communities who did not lie under the category of Muslim or practicing Islam. So in a sense, this idea is also radically infused within the Islamic culture and maybe fiqh or Sharia, that the difference is not completely alienated, but it is allowed. In the sense, when you mentioned that if you're tax paying and now you're under the sovereignty or the administrative unit of an empire that may be Islamic, but even then, if you are coming from a different worldview or a different way of thinking about life, you're allowed to practice that and to build your own codes. And that was even true for Ottomans, the millet system. So it is very similar to the idea of legal pluralism these days. But why is he still misinterpreted? How is he misinterpreted in the contemporary context? Even though when there is this separation of power, he becoming even what you're arguing, that even people can claim towards him that he did something wrong and hold him accountable. While I understand he's not this perfect figure. I mean, he is a ruler. He has all of his flaws. So this one end of the spectrum is, making him as like a perfect king, which is not. But the other spectrum is to make him the complete demon. So how do you see this binary of seeing Aurangzeb himself?
Well, this is a great question. I mean, thankfully, there are some studies coming out recently by respected scholars who are finally getting around to writing proper biographies of Aurangzeb that I hope will supersede what we've been living with now for over a century, which is the work of Jagannath Sarkar. Jagannath Sarkar, of course, was the historian of Aurangzeb. He wrote a 5 or 6 volume biography. But Sarkar was not a neutral observer. He was living during the national movement, of course. He wrote this book in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, when India was aflame with the national movement, the Indian National Congress, and there was a movement to conceive of a post-British India. So Sarkar was an historian, a very good historian, very able historian, competent historian. But he was ultimately concerned with showing why Aurangzeb failed, and almost in a sense of blaming the collapse of the empire on the overreach of Aurangzeb. And not just territorial overreach, but the idea of trying to swallow the entire Deccan Plateau and spending 25 years, fruitless years, trying to accomplish that. But also in the sense that he was seen as biased against Hindus, and Sarkar was not as hostile as many other historians would be after him, but he certainly set the tone. Mm. And I think that Aurangzeb's reputation as a temple-bashing fanatic, even a tyrant, is a product of, in part, the national movement, where you needed to look to the pre-colonial past for models of who were the good kings and who were the bad kings. What are we going to be once the British go? And so for many Indians, especially those in Maharashtra, the idea was to look to Shivaji as the role model. And of course, the opposite of that would be his own enemy, Shivaji's great enemy, who was Aurangzeb.
Mm-hmm. So it's like a circular.
So yeah, that's right. In a sense, that whole binary between Shivaji and Aurangzeb has not left us. It's still very much with us today. And it's tragic that historians and historiography in India and that in Pakistan are almost on 2 different worlds, where one country's villain is the other country's hero, and vice versa. That is a direct consequence of partition, that much of it. I mean, I'm trying to say there are a lot of factors that go into all this. But the irony is that of all the Mughal emperors, Aurangzeb was the most venerated, not just in his own day, but in the subsequent century. There was a huge proliferation, for example, of images of Aurangzeb that were patronized even in the courts of Hindu states that had been enemies of the Mughals. He was seen, the phrase in his own day was Alamgir Zendapir, which means Alamgir, the living saint. And he was considered to have magical powers. And it's true that he actually did, on occasion, practice what we would call magic in order to be seen as, in a sense, supernatural.
What do you mean by he used to practice magic?
Okay, one case, when he was in the Deccan, campaigning, he had a huge camp, thousands of people in this camp. The Bhima River was flooding, and it looked like it was going to overtake the entire camp and wash away everybody. Aurangzeb, we are told by a contemporary account, Bhimsen Saxena, who in a sense admired Aurangzeb, although he was Hindu himself. He recorded that Aurangzeb wrote on slips of paper some magical symbols and then put the paper on the water. And as soon as he put the paper on the water receded. And there was no flood. Now, that story took off, and among all people, as defining Aurangzeb as having some kind of saintly power. And as I said, this trope of Alamgir Zendapir, Alamgir the living saint, became part of the vocabulary of Indians everywhere. And Aurangzeb, I would argue that what he did was, although he rejected the idea of sacred kingship, he on occasion would deploy it strategically, if it's true that he actually did these things. So there were these stories. And what I'm trying to say is that Aurangzeb in his own day was not seen as some temple-bashing demon. In fact, as far as I know, there was only a handful of temples that he actually did destroy. But the point is, he did engage in temple desecration. But again, it was always in the context of political rebellion of some kind. Yeah.
So, Dr. Eaton, we have come to the point where we've understood that the way the history happened is radically different. The way things really occurred is radically different from the way it is being interpreted, conceived, and normalized. Especially when you highlighted the fact that the partition, the making of nation states, it demands a certain level of national rhetoric or a national history or a national memory for people to be aligned as citizens as part of this larger story of a nation that you've become. And in the case of Pakistan, India and Bangladesh, that necessitated, as you argued, that one nation's hero must be another nation's villain. For example, Iqbal. For example, Jinnah. For example, Gandhi, Nehru. All of these are figures which are differently interpreted, differently conceived, and differently utilized in the public memory to achieve certain goals. So in this day and age where history is weaponized, it is instrumentalized and even, used for violence. Massive riots, lynchings, this is happening in India. And of course, India and Pakistan and Bangladesh must have their own local problems. So what do we, not me, you, as a historian, as a teller of story, as a category of people, what is the responsibility? How do we deal with this situation?
My short answer is that I think that historians have to get out of their ivory towers and stop writing books that are not comprehensible to ordinary people. And here I'm criticizing a lot of my colleagues in my own university. Again, I will not name any names, but I do know many historians who think that the mark of being the mark of erudition and high scholarship is writing prose that is virtually incomprehensible. And what I think India needs, and this problem is more severe in India than it is America, because in India there already is a deep substrate of mythology. I mean, one of the great contrasts between India and China is that really there's virtually nothing close to a mythological past in Chinese tradition. Yeah, they're obsessed with, you know, the actual events that happened in the actual province. And whereas in India, there's this whole question of mythology and the power that has over people. And I contrast mythology with biography. I had that problem when I was writing this book on the social history of the Deccan, where I realized that some of my people that I was writing about were already mythologized, and it's very difficult to get at the historical person sometimes when you have accounts written in kind of by anonymous authors 100 years later, yes, which is really a collection of probable mythology. So that's the thing. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that if historians do not write clear history which is based on evidence in language that is comprehensible to ordinary people, then the empty space will be filled up by demagogues and myth makers and people who have no proper understanding of the past as it actually did happen. All they know is how it should have happened. And this is the danger. So I guess what I'm really, to answer your question, what I'm addressing are my fellow historians, not just in India, but anywhere.
So must academic historians also attempt to be public intellectuals?
I think there are various ways of addressing the problem, and public intellectuals is one. But I think I go back to the old-fashioned business of evidence-based history writing, which starts with good questions and will end with logical and evidence-based conclusions. And I just want to say one last thing about that. There's a great deal of anxiety and fear in the historical profession these days because everyone thinks that AI is going to replace everything. And I'm here to remind you, to assure you that that is not going to happen. Why? Because AI cannot sift evidence and make judgments. If you ask AI, who was the better painter, Renoir or Monet? It has no answer. It can only tell you, well, this is a subjective matter. There's lots of, Monet was doing this and Renoir was doing that. It can scoop up all kinds of data from all over the world, but it cannot make a judgment. And historians, by definition, have to decide which kind of evidence is more credible than another kind of evidence and why. That's making judgment. AI cannot do that. And I don't think ever will, for that matter.
And I agree with you. I often discuss this issue with a lot of my friends who are interested in philosophy of AI and philosophy of ideas. What humans actually do is expand the limits of knowledge by constructing new theoretical paradigms and frameworks. What AI is only able to achieve is to whatever knowledge is existent, to analyze that, scoop it, and come up with an answer. It is that creativity of expanding the limits and frontiers of theorization is uniquely human.
AI cannot do that. Yes. I agree with you.
So, Dr. Eaton, it was lovely talking to you, extremely illuminating. You're one of those historians that all of us have read. We've been reading your work. We've been learning from your work, and hopefully you're already 83, 84, I think. 84. And the kind of energy and the kind of passion you have towards writing history and, telling these narratives, I think you will continue to write and teach another decade, hopefully, and we will benefit from them. And inshallah, in the future, I hope that I get the chance to have this communication podcast with you again.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I just want to thank you for making this possible. It's been a lot of fun.
Yes.